of the Bioethics and Subject Advocacy. Oops, he just started recording, so I'll do it now. Sorry. Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Schwartz. I'm the director of the IU Center for Bioethics and of the Bioethics program for the CTSI here. And I'm pleased to welcome you to our first of the 2023-2024 academic year, our first TREATS talk, the Translational Research Ethics Applied Topics talk series. And these are introduction to key topics in translational research ethics. They are recorded and put online. We come to the Center for Bioethics website to find those. Also, we include references of interest, often things the speaker spoke about. We're lucky today to have Andrew Brightman, who is the professor of engineering practice at Purdue University, but more importantly, is a longstanding member, faculty member of the Bioethics and Subject Advocacy program of the CTSI. And he'll be speaking to us today on ethics issues in design and testing of medical technologies. The talks generally run about 30 minutes, depending on the speaker, and then we usually engage in a conversation after that about questions and expansions. So Andrew, Professor Brightman, thank you, and off to you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope this becomes a good conversation at the end. I will do some I have a few slides, more than I had imagined, as always. But there's a bit of a partial case at the end. We could use some discussions, and certainly I'm open to questions from anyone in the audience that if I'm going too fast or not clear about something, I'd really appreciate that. I'm taking this from the perspective of being an engineer focused on medical devices, and innovation, design, and testing are areas that I'm most interested in and teach on, and particularly ethical engineering. And so while there'll be some clear connections in translational research to clinical studies, human subjects research, I'm trying to focus this talk a bit unique in the sense that it's about the phase of medical device development, which is design and testing. So I'm going to share my slide here. Guess no one can see it yet. Let's make sure. Is that visible? Okay, make that, hopefully the little thing at the top will go away.
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, yeah, thank you, I got you. I'm trying to get the bar at the top to go away, but it's not anyway.
It's gone away on my screen, so.
Okay, great. It's showing up on mine. Thanks, Peter. So here's what I want to cover today. I want to talk a little bit about diversity of medical devices. There's such a wide range. A little bit about the regulatory pathways. The regulation of medical devices is really an ethical analysis and ethical basis for that in terms of safety and effectiveness. We'll talk about those pathways. The complexity of the device development process raises a lot of complex ethics issues, and we'll go over a few of those. A number that come to mind immediately in terms of device-specific ethic issues as differentiated from maybe drug development or other biologics development. We'll do part of a case example, and then I have a few references at the end if people have interested in more reading. As always, these TREAT talks are meant to be just a primer, a start of a conversation, not the full-fledged information. And if you want more information, advice, and consulting, particularly on the ethics issues, then the Center for Bioethics is ready and willing to provide ethics consultation. You can find the request form at the Bioethics and Participant Advocacy Program page, or you can contact Nick Oliver, the program manager, who's online here, and his email is here. The other advice and consulting opportunity is an organization, a core program of Indiana CTSI, of which I'm part. And there's actually two components. It's called the think tank. And there's a think tank for devices and a think tank for drugs. These are advisory groups that help people who are interested in research and development of devices and drugs towards commercialization. So not sort of basic research discovery, but really going to the next stage of commercialization, and lots of ethics issues show up there as well. There's a link to the web page for the think tanks, and Dr. Cara Garcia is the navigator for the think tank device, and her email is there as well. So I want to just remind us, all of us have had interactions with medical devices at some level, whether it's for our own treatment or treatment of family members or hospital visits, or even just to the primary care checkup, because medical devices range from the most simple to very complex devices. They can have diagnostic roles to monitoring, to assistive technologies, to therapeutic roles. They can be external. You can think of many wearable technologies, and that's a huge growth area, both for therapeutic and diagnostic, and even in clinical studies now trying to understand human health, as well as the more familiar implantable devices such as defibrillators or hip implants. Devices can be simple mechanical tools to complex digital or imaging equipment, ranging from disposable gloves or cotton swabs to large equipment like an MRI instrument. There's the range from everyday use to specialty equipment. So the design and testing needs to be in lots of context unique to that particular use area. And then there's also clinical versus home use sorts of technologies that we have to think about. Ones that are designed to go home with a patient or to be set up in a home care situation, or off-site clinical care, or in the hospital. Universal to custom fit device design is important. Some require custom fit or custom analysis. Stents, for example, implantable stents are now, some of them aortic stents are being designed specific for the patient versus universal. And the perhaps most important typography of medical devices is the low to high risk. And this is how FDA classifies devices and how it regulates them, with different levels of regulation and evaluation based on their risk. Here's a diagram that just shows that the majority of medical devices are low risk, class 1. There's quite a number of medium risk, class 2, that have special regulations. And then, of course, the most risk life-saving equipment often, or life-changing if they fail, class 3, high risk, which require the highest level of clinical investigation, testing, and trials. You can imagine some of the different devices that we've mentioned in each of these areas. And in fact, the range of risk to benefit is a key element at which the FDA is evaluating, in which the ethics are looking at how much beneficence, how much risk of harm or non-maleficence is a constant design trade-off, and a feature of the ethics analysis and design and development and testing. Because no devices are without risk. They all have some risk benefit, a risk of harm, potential for benefit profile. So the FDA, as a regulatory agency with under the laws of the government and Congress, has some very specific guidances on what is a medical device. And I put this here, not that we need to belabor it, and the language is very specific, but it just shows that the dimension at which when the FDA regulates medical devices, they're being very specific about a certain category. It's an instrument, apparatus, an implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar or related article, including a component part or its accessory, which it has the following three components. And these are important to the FDA and to device developers. It has to be includes one or all of these recognized in the official national formulary or pharmacopoeia. It's intended for the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man and animals. So in both human medicine and veterinary medicine, devices are have to have these components. But a key differentiator from drugs is that these are intended to affect the structure or function of the body without having a primary chemical reaction or not dependent on being metabolized. So that separates out drugs. And in many cases, devices do not include the software functions. They're excluded into another category. Now, that's a very narrow definition, and it's being blurred daily by new innovative devices that include combination devices. I'll talk about those in a minute. But we have many biological components. One of the technologies that I was involved with was based on a biological material, but in fact, it was categorized as a device because it was a structure and structure function and not a metabolized biologic. So it was really interesting how that one got classified. Some other differences between devices and drugs. They typically have devices have an engineered set of components, whereas the small molecule drugs are a chemical formulation. So the manufacture is quite different. Direct mechanisms of action, usually very clear, readily apparent near-term responses versus a biochemical mechanism of action that may have a time period of and a kinetic response. Medical devices are often very organ-specific or site-specific, whereas small molecule compounds typically are systemic. And these differences really do change the way we do testing and design and the way we think about the ethical issues that arise. Patient responses in medical devices tend to be more similar because of the devices are mostly the same when implanted versus drugs that are dose dependent, both on their benefit and adverse effects. Now this data and this table is from 2010 from the Institute of Medicine, and I think there's some huge differences now in dose response of certain implantable, like a brain implant can have significant dose responses based on the signal and frequency that's being sent into the brain. A key thing about cost and the financial is that most of these devices are quite expensive right up front, and they have a particular lifetime, whereas drug costs can be much lower, but you have to keep taking them, and so they costs accumulate with use. A key aspect of many medical devices is they require some sort of professional expertise. They often have complex instructions for use or maintenance, and that requires specialized technical support or training for those who are using them. And if they're a home use or a patient use, then there's special concerns there for abilities of patients to comply with those instructions. Whereas drugs are often either injectable or if they're pills, can be taken and applied rather straightforward. Not always true. Chemotherapeutic agents obviously have some very specialized applications and controls. Another difference in devices and drugs, the continued product refinement. So quite often a medical device gets to the market in a sort of a iterative process. It's been refined over a period of time, but often within a period of a few years, there's a new version out, a new model, an upgrade, a change, which can be quite challenging for issues of safety, issues of influence, of effectiveness, particularly if they're implanted devices that are intended for long-term use. The development costs are quite high up front for small molecule compounds, discovery and development, but devices have high development costs. They just tend to accumulate over time. And then finally, the quality control challenges are really high with medical devices, in part because the systems are often quite complex, not for very simple tools, but if you have a complex electrical, mechanical, and biological or fluid system, that has lots of challenges we'll talk about. Okay, so combination products are combinations of drugs, devices, and biologics. I'm not going to talk about these, but you can think about a drug-loaded stent or a drug-loaded syringe. These are regulated differently and have their own complexity of ethical issues. I'm not going to go into those today, but I think it's important to see that there's a lot of overlap. The Class 1 regulations are general controls. These are mostly disposables or single-use or tools that are, the safety and effectiveness are fairly standard, well-known. They need to be manufactured with good manufacturing practices, compliance with standards and performance, and any adverse events get reported to the FDA. All of these general controls, including registration of devices and record keeping, are required for all the other higher level risk devices, such as the Class 2. Class 2 devices go through a pre-market notification. That's a clearance. Many people know it by its regulation number, 510, Code of Federal Regulations 510 subletter K. These are low to moderate risk. They have specialized controls and have to demonstrate substantial equivalence that is to a legally marketed device that's a predicate. So these are devices that are approved based on a predicate. This goes back to the 1976 Medical Device Authorization Act, and they grandfathered in a lot of devices and then said, okay, if your new device is essentially or substantially equivalent in safety and effectiveness to that previous device, you can prove that, we'll let you market it without any further extensive clinical trials or clinical data. Now, this has been challenged and changed over the last several decades, in part because you can get a chain of predicates. Okay, well, this device is predicate to that device, and it goes down the line, and pretty soon the third or fourth generation doesn't look quite at all like the original predicate. And sometimes there are predicate devices that have failed, and then how do you ethically move forward with approvals of a device that has a predicate that has substantial problems? And you're saying, oh, ours is substantially equivalent in its safety and effectiveness, which doesn't mean much of anything. So this process, which is intended to speed devices to market and to clinical use where they can be effective without incurring a lot of clinical evidence, costs, and time, has stayed in the process, but is being challenged every year. And then the devices that have the highest risk, they're life-supporting or life-sustaining, or could have significant risk of harm. These require the highest level of scientific and regulatory review. So you need clear clinical evidence of safety and effectiveness to get these drugs into clinical use. This process is expensive, and it takes 5 to 10 years in many cases to get a new device. These are considered not don't have predicates or have a high risk profile that can't be measured easily in bench testing or animal testing. There's two other regulatory pathways I don't want to talk about this time, but it's important to know that there's a de novo pathway which allows devices that are approved, particularly in other countries, such as this detectable device pill that detects blood in the gastrointestinal tract, developed in Ireland and marketed in the EU, is been now allowed, cleared for de novo, for use through the de novo pathway in the US. And then there's humanitarian device exemptions. These are devices particularly for orphan diseases or benefit patients, diagnostic and treatment of small populations. And a recent approval was for a device that fixes the in neonatal patients a birth defect where the esophagus is not connected to the gastric rest of the gastric system. So I want to talk a little bit about complexity of device development. So in addition to all the regulatory controls that help protect safety and effectiveness, or non-maleficence and beneficence, those ethical issues, there's a complex device development pathway that ensures that by the time a device gets to be submitted for regulatory approval to go to clinic, a lot of the testing and understanding of the device functionality have been optimized. So on the side is a diagram that shows, you start with a great idea, you have some user needs, unmet medical need or an improvement on a previous device, and you start quickly and immediately with understanding what's the regulatory strategy, what class is this device, and what are the requirements for design, testing, and eventual approval or clearance. You go through a process of design planning, creating design inputs, which this is how you determine, okay, what is going to be effective and what's going to be safe? What will our specifications need to be when we manufacture this? Those initial specifications get built into prototypes. The prototypes get tested through multiple iterative processes of design, development, and testing. And when design outputs, the testing of the devices meets the design inputs, that's called the verification stage. At that point, it can go into the practice of validating whether this device actually solves the user need or the clinical problem. And that is the validation step is often where the clinical testing or animal testing or human clinical testing come into play. It's not until that point that in the regulatory and development pathway that it's considered a medical device and can be submitted for approval for use. That process is iterative, can take a number of years, and that's where I want to focus discussion about design inputs and testing of outputs to think about ethical issues, because a key idea in the ethical issues of design and testing of medical devices is that early stage evaluation and consideration of the ethics issues that are potential down the road in the full product lifecycle, it can really prevent failures down the road. It can be costly to have to go back and to recall or redo tests or redesign and remanufacture, and certainly the potential for harm to patients if this is not thought about in advance. So when we teach engineers and researchers to think about the ethics, we say all the way through from the beginning to the end of the product lifecycle, which includes in many cases product recovery or retirement or the waste issues that are involved when you're making millions of these devices and they're going out and being used, and then what do you do with them at the end of the product life, and monitoring well into and throughout clinical use. So thinking about what are the potential ethical issues that are going to be encountered is key. So medical devices have a long life cycle of product development, and there are ethics issues at all stages to be considered. Okay, one more complex diagram here, and it's really not for you to consume all the details, but it does show you that there's, in the multiple phases of product definition and design through testing and redesign, into clinical testing and into final manufacture before it goes to regulatory approval. There are multiple phases and components within that, which include usability studies, technology development, meaning the intellectual property and commercialization issues. There's the quality system that has to be in place, the regulatory support for eventual regulatory approval that starts in phase 0. And then there's scale up for manufacturing. You really have to think about how do you manufacture this from the beginning and what might be the manufacturing issues. Now, the key elements or key places where design testing occur, obviously we think of the final human clinical trials where devices are proven for effectiveness and safety. These can be multiple year studies, multiple site studies, involving all the issues that we think about with human subjects and clinical trial ethics. But prior to that, getting to that stage, there's early stage proof of concept testing, which often involves humans and as well as animals. And there are ethics issues in what's the ethical requirement for oversight at those stages? When is it just a simple device proof of concept test versus a research and generalized information about this that's going to go into the approval documentation. There's alpha or early stage prototype verification of design inputs and validation of design outputs, and then secondary or iterative process to the final product in the beta verification and validation. It's at this point that it's called a design freeze, and the technology is then can't really be changed from here on out through clinical study, through approval, and into clinical use. If there's going to be a change, a significant change of any sort to the way the device is designed, functions, or manufactured, or even to the quality management system, there may be a potential you have to go back to approval stages and document every change and its impact on safety and effectiveness. So what are some device-specific ethics issues? I categorize these in terms of the four principles of bioethics, the non-maleficence and beneficence we've already talked about. That's what the FDA cares about. Regulatory oversight, safety and effectiveness is also what IRBs look at in terms of human subjects, research ethics. But there's also issues of respect for autonomy under consent and dignity, and issues of justice, accessibility, and usability for medical devices that I want to bring up, and would suggest that these are being considered more now within the FDA, particularly in diversity of clinical trials. Respect for autonomy, there's potentials for harm in both of these two additional areas that are not what I would call primary areas of regulatory oversight, but need to be considered in early stage device design and testing. So I would propose that the complexity of these medical devices really support a wider range of potential harms than drugs do, and so require perhaps more rigorous or broader thinking about what the ethics issues are, including things like user errors at multiple levels. I mentioned if it's a complicated device, the implantation may be complicated and require specialized training, or if it's a participant or patient user control or monitoring, then it may require training at that level as well. There's issues of biocompatibility in the body, whether it's external or internal. There's issues of sterility, particularly for complex multi-unit devices. complicated conflicts of interest with industry representatives sometimes required in maintenance or in implant training or in explant issues. If it's a digital sort of technology, there's issues of data fidelity and security, information privacy, data usage, transparency. If third parties have to manipulate the data before it's useful in a decision-making tool or before it gets back to a clinician or a patient. There's multiple levels of privacy and confidentiality issues with devices. A drug could be administered and taken and no one would know that that's happening. But if it's particularly a wearable device or a prosthesis or some other kinds of implantable devices that are attached, it's often quite obvious that that's happening, which can have psychosocial impact, can have impact on autonomy and self-determination, as well as issues of dignity and respect. So I want to talk about some of these in the next few slides, more specifically, breaking down non-maleficence or the safety issue. There's the iterative device design and testing that's required to evaluate and mitigate risk of harm. It's really important to have a robust risk analysis and management system from the beginning. So you have to think about where the potential risks are, whether they're physical risks or emotional risks or psychosocial risks, what kind of harm could happen and how will they be mitigated all the way throughout the testing phase, the manufacture phase, the deployment phase, and ultimately monitoring as well into post-market surveillance, post-clinical use. An important aspect I mentioned is early phase testing for effectiveness often requires human participants. So you have folks who are involved in early stage design to see if the device works, have to understand when to engage regulatory oversight of the IRB or the FDA. Typically, it's earlier than most researchers and inventors think, and that's an important consideration. The complicated designs that are involved that have multiple components have real sterility changes. Typically, if you have plastics and metals and electronics, sterilizing that, or if you have lumens or tubes or hidden spots that might have potential for either bacterial, endotoxin, or other kinds of contaminations, these pose unique challenges to medical devices for safety. All through the various stages of manufacture. Complicated devices also means that there's fewer devices that get made and tested, and typically a smaller and less diverse population. It's a lot easier to make thousands of pills and millions of pills and get them into huge clinical trials. But early phase studies for devices are often quite small. And it's important to expand the size and the diversity of clinical trials, particularly as the complications of the devices show that there's increased risk. And particularly if human anatomy is important or physical ability is important to use the device or to apply the device, if it needs to be specific to a particular user's ability to manipulate it or to fit in a particular anatomy, you have to have a diverse clinical trial that covers the populations that are intended to treat. This limited clinical testing can also lead to undetected harms and early market failures. The case that I'll talk about is one of many that happen where the first iteration of a device is tested on a small population, and then some failures show up 1, 2, 3 years into device usage. And so post-market surveillance is really essential. And finally, in this category, although there are others that I can imagine, particularly smart and connected devices, digital health devices, and even smart devices like implants that have monitoring controls on them that feed out through RFID to databases, they have cybersecurity issues. And so the design and testing has to have a view to potential hacking and hacking trends that are that change with time. Beneficence or the effectiveness of the medical device for treatment or diagnosis has a number of ethics issues related to that. Again, physical abilities and human anatomies can differ widely across populations and thus influence the effectiveness. So you have to have diverse clinical trials for effectiveness. Clinical trial design can also be complex. Challenges of sham, placebo, or crossover studies with devices have always been a challenge. So you have to have careful clinical trial design. If you think about implanting a brain with a device or a hip or something that with a new design, how do you compare that? You compare it to standards of previous implants, or if it's a completely novel device, you need solid controls to determine if it's actually more effective than the previous version. Clinical trial design can also be complex due to the learning curve for the implanting surgeon, if it's an implantable device, or for the user operation. And so device trial planning and preparation and training have to be part of that to understand, is this reliable data? Or if it's a highly dependent on training and technique, how well will it perform, the device perform when it gets into general use? This is also another reason for early failure in clinical use, is the training or the preparation for clinical use was not clearly communicated or carried out. Specialized manufacturing processes to make some of these lead to potential quality and reliability failures. This is why design for manufacturing and quality control is really essential. This is a huge ethics issue. The device developers need to think of, if you have a unique manufacturing process, that process has to be evaluated just as closely as the device function itself, because you have to ensure that every device functions and is safe when it's manufactured. And then again, the significance trainings and technical maintenance that are required for many of these mean that we have to design for that usability. We have to design for the repair and post-market surveillance. If you can't track where that device is in the body, or where, you have to have a registration to know which ones are out there, so post-market surveillance can determine if there are adverse events and which ones are failing and in which populations. And that's important to determining how to repair or explant or in fact create a new device or take it off the market. Respect for autonomy, the consent and dignity issues that add to beneficence or safety and effectiveness, and permanent or difficult to explant devices pose challenges to consent. Once you get a device in your body, if you decide you don't want it anymore, that's always a problem. So patients need to be fully informed. The problem is, can you always predict what the potential risk is long-term if it's a new device on the market? There's not a lot of long-term data, but you want patients who consent to a device to know what they're getting into, particularly if it's difficult to explant. Implanted neurological devices really have challenges, particularly if they shift brain function or hormonal activity, or and people personality shifts or sense of identity shifts. This is seen in some of the deep brain implants that are used to treat various both physical disease as well as emotional diseases, depression and other I think some schizophrenic disorders as well being tested. This complicates the consenting process enormously, and so we have to think about these before the device gets fully approved. I mentioned that visible external wearing devices, wearable devices, especially those with user interactions or alarms or controls, these can involve stigma or social impact if they're highly visible or require attention during social activities. patient-centric design or co-design can be really valuable early in the process, getting participants to help understand how it's actually going to be used and what might be the failure modes or what might be the potential ethical issues that are faced, and how comfortable people are either physically or emotionally with using the device. And then finally, this co-design and usability testing has challenges around, particularly around neurodiverse participants. And there's some ethical concerns related to vulnerable populations. So special IRB oversight, participant advocacy should be considered in those cases if the device is designed to treat certain populations. And finally, justice. We're talking about accessibility, usability issues and just distribution. Again, back to human anatomies and physical abilities differing wildly across populations, so diverse clinical trials for usability are critical, making sure that populations are comfortable using it, understand how to use it, are going to be successful using it. Custom designed devices often provide better safety or effectiveness, but then tend to cost a lot more, and that limits accessibility. So determining a cost effectiveness design trade-off early in the design and testing is key to having a market that is ethical distribution. Complex devices with high cost, as many of them do, and that require training and maintenance, will often limit distribution to rural or low resource communities, and thus limit the just distribution of the healthcare access to various target populations. So you want to think ahead to determine what the ethical distribution or market value might be for populations that would be limited in their accessibility. And finally, these complex devices that require training often require device company representatives to participate in the patient procedures, implantation or explantation or adjusting or affecting the treatment values. That raises ethical concerns about patient privacy, data fidelity, industry influence, and significant conflicts of interest. It's clear that if the industry rep is in the room with the clinician, with the researcher in the clinical trial evaluation, there is influence there. So there's an important need to ensure transparency about that potential industry influence or conflict of interest with the participants, with the public who learn about the device and how it was tested, and certainly the clinical trial evaluators. So I got a case about Essure, but I want to just pause here to see, are there any questions about all of that? That was a lot of information downloaded quickly. I wanted to have a bit of a background. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, what's fascinating about that information is the multiple stages and multiple sets of issues that come up at every stage. I think when probably I even invited you to do this talk, I thought, oh, we'll just talk about trials. But of course, as you emphasize in your teaching, I know, and I'm reminded now, as you emphasized here, the planning for ethical testing starts with piloting and has some very unusual characteristics for devices, which you've described so well. So I found that incredibly helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's important that it's clear to folks, clinicians and engineers both, that want to develop a technology that would solve an unmet medical need, that it's very early in the process. You have to think about these regulatory issues as well as the ethics. I mean, I consider regulatory issues to be ethically based. Yeah, so yeah, I wanted to just talk a little bit about Essure. We're not going to dig deep into it. It's a kind of a complex situation. Some of you may have heard of this device, medical device. It was highlighted in a 2017 documentary called The Bleeding Edge. It's been in the news for the last 8 or 9 years, and a complex situation. But I think the question is, could some of the problems be prevented? with more ethical analysis and more rigorous clinical testing, design and testing. So Essure, for those of you who might not know about it, is a non-surgical, non-hormonal medical device. It's intended for permanent contraception or sterilization. It was developed by Conceptus originally. It got approved for market in 2002, was sold to Bayer in 2015. I think it was maybe 2013. Now I should have checked that number. But the Essure device is, you can see in that picture, it's just a little metal coil. And I chose that picture in part because if some of you know about another medical device failure, and this is definitely a failure, the Theranos case, the diagnostic device case, I'm really concerned about marketing that shows some medical device that's held between the fingers and marketed as, this is an important device, you can hold it in your fingers, it's real. Anyway, that's an aside. But this device is a medical spring-like nickel titanium alloy and stainless steel. It gets inserted into fallopian tubes through the cervix, and it's intended to create scar tissue and close the fallopian tubes around the inserts to block and prevent contraception. So permanent sterilization is the second most common contraceptive approach for women in the US, according to reports in 2015. About 350 women per year would undergo this surgical treatment, and the standard surgical is laparoscopic tubal ligation. Time-consuming, complex, fairly complex surgical, requires hospitalization. And so there was a medical need for something that worked better, was easier to treat, and perhaps, and certainly equally effective, perhaps even less complications. So Essure was developed with that market need in mind, helping people not get pregnant without having to spend a time in the hospital. So be cheaper and less pain or complication potential. And the idea was that if these devices could be inserted in a doctor's office with a simple insertion device, then outpatient leaving the clinician without entering the hospital, leaving the doctor's office, and with a follow-up within 3 months. And in fact, between 2002 and 22, over 750,000 women in the US received the Essure device. However, the FDA received, during that same time, almost 70,000 medical device reports. The majority of those were reported by the women themselves who had been implanted, until about 2015, when the FDA convened a second panel to evaluate all of these adverse events and required reporting from the company. So medical device reporting is not required in most cases of adverse advice. It's voluntary, except in certain cases that it's part of the approval for the highest level risk, or devices that have enormous reports of adverse failures. And so this was a problematic case. It went for 13, 12 years before the FDA stepped in. In 2015 is when they reconvened the device panel that initially evaluated safety and effectiveness. And they wanted to look at the post-market studies so far, and they wanted to require some additional post-market surveillance of what's happening to these women. The safety concerns raised included a wide range of tubal perforation. So basically these devices were getting shot through the tissue, ending up in other places in the abdomen or in the cervix, or even into other parts of fallopian tube, cross the fallopian tube, leading to intractable pain, bleeding, eventual hysterectomies, because this was a device designed not to be explanted. And in fact, it turns out that trying to remove it with a surgical procedure often fragmented the device. It broke, leaving fragments then irretractably embedded, and even more complex related health problems. So the question is, could these adverse events been detected sooner or avoided altogether if there'd been a higher quality pre-marketing and as well as post-marketing evaluations and more timely and transparent disseminations of study results? So in 2015, actually 2014, 15, there were a number of folks starting to look into this problem, including news agencies. Lots of people were getting on board, and eventually in I think it was 2016, the documentary came out. But a CNN analysis showed that between 2013 and 2017, 2013 was when Bayer acquired it. 2013 to 2017, Bayer was paying lots of doctors to implant this and for consulting fees to increase the usage of Essure, despite the fact that, as you can see there, thousands of adverse events were being reported, including unexpected pregnancies, dislodged devices, device breakage, migration. Surprisingly, a wide number of nickel allergies or alloy allergies, even though the device was used by a pretty standard alloy for medical technologies, medical devices. Perhaps something about its placement in the uterus, in the fallopian tubes, was causing specific reactions. It's still not clear. And then other weight fluctuations, fatigue, headaches, irregular menstruation, and abdominal pains were highly reported. So in 2016, FDA eventually put a black box warning on it. They allowed it to continue to be sold. It was actually continued to be implanted until 2020, I believe, in Europe, but in the US, Bayer stopped selling the device in 2018 and recalled it in 2019 completely, so all the devices. So how did this device fail so badly? Obviously, it had a lot of problems, even though it was very effective for a large number of women. 70,000 is less than 10% of the women were having problems. 90% were being successful, but is that an acceptable device failure? Is that ethical to allow that out there onto the market? Eventually, it was determined no. But looking back at the approval process, in 2002, when Essure was approved in the pre-market approval, so at the highest level, pre-market approval is that class 3 device, highest level of evaluation, but it was only based on 2 clinical studies, non-randomized, non-blinded prospective studies, lacking a comparator group, even though this was a completely novel device. The total enrollment was 900, a little over 900 women. The FDA concluded from the clinical information that 97% of the women who had bilateral Essure placement could rely on the device for contraception. However, even at that time, the data shown to the FDA described up to 14% failure rate for the first attempt at bilateral coil placement. Now, you've got to get this coil in exactly the right place in both fallopian tubes for it to work. And clearly, there were lots of failures of getting it local placed. And in fact, multiple studies, situations in this clinical trial, in both of these clinical trials, showed that the device was deployed sometimes 2 or 3 times in each fallopian tube, trying to get it into the right place. And so it wasn't actually described, it was considered an effective delivery if at least one of those devices ended up in the right place. A couple of other challenges was follow-up. Only 85% of the women who actually had what they called successful placement were followed up at 1 year for effectiveness, and 92% for safety. And safety was considered, was it causing any adverse outcomes at 1 year? And only 25% of those women were followed up for a second year. It's a very short timeline. So my question is, could something be done here? This is a case where clearly there were not effective studies done early on and before this was approved, and the device manufacturers had limited knowledge with a small population. And the ability to implant this device was much more challenging than anyone understood. So they had not done effective usability studies. They also had not trained anyone for removal, and therefore this device failed and was removed from market. The FDA did ask for in 2015, asked for a second study. This study was not fully published. It stopped enrolling after 500 women and reported fairly high procedural device malfunctions and adverse effects. Even still, in 2015, it was still deemed as a successful contraceptive.
I have to warn you, Andrew, people will be stepping away at 2 o'clock, which is a couple of minutes.
Okay.
I think you're good.
I'm done.
Oh yeah, there you go. That's all.
Thank you, Peter.
But no, of course, anybody needs to leave, please feel free. We can continue the conversation, maybe 5 more minutes for any responses. I think that case is absolutely, you may have seen my face as you presented. I'm not sure if I was laughing or crying over the disasters there. It certainly brings home the way in which the ethical design and testing of devices really falls on a burden on the researcher and the person developing it, because you may not be able to rely on regulation to really make sure things are done right. There's a lot of concerns now about this sped up FDA approval processes in many areas, including pills, and some questions there. But this is a horrendous, horrifying story you tell, Andrew. Anybody else with questions for Dr. Brightman?
Yes, I had a question. Would you mind going back 2 slides?
This one?
I think it was the next one, but it's all right. My question is this: did the researchers consider the, I guess, skill issue of implanting the device successfully? Was that one of the issues that they considered prior to marketing?
I can't know what was in their minds, but clearly they did not prepare even the folks who were participating in these 2 clinical studies that they did, because there were a number of clear failures during the study, multiple attempts. So I think even at the design level, they must not have understood how this was going to work. They had some imagined idea and didn't do enough usability studies to see if it actually would be delivered the way they imagined it.
And if I might follow up on that, has there been any regulatory change in response to this case?
Not that I know of specific to, it's certainly specific to this device, but specific to a classification or pre-market approvals, no. I think those remain. It's still mostly voluntary for adverse event reporting. It's still mostly voluntary. You have to designate what kind of training you're doing, but you don't have to prove that your training is effective, which is a problem. So they assume that if the clinical trial works, then your training was effective. Those are good questions. Thank you. And this is, I picked this case, but it's just one of many cases that have, in the last 10 years, really failed sort of extraordinarily. And that's I pick out a failure case because it shows the importance of doing it right. Often device developers do it right, and we have effective devices on the market. But when they don't do it correctly and they don't consider these, it has dire consequences.
More questions from the group? Again, I know we're at 2 o'clock.
Yeah. Sorry for going long.
No, it's a lot of information to convey, and really is amazingly. It's again, I was struck by how extensive and continuous the pressure, the necessity of doing the ethical review and the plans, feasibility, accessibility, all the way from the piloting phase all the way through the testing. Although the one you were giving us of a horror story is it was classified as a class 3 device then, Andrew, is that right? Yeah. So that's the most extensive testing. I'm also fascinated what you mentioned earlier about the ones where there's sort of a telephone problem, where the first one is approved because it's analogous to an approved previous one. The next one gets approved because it's analogous to that one. And eventually you have, robots doing surgery when the one that was approved before was just a fancy scalpel or something. So that's just a fascinating story too. And those cases must be interesting. And again, they point to the necessity for regulation. We're not regulators. I see Chris is on here, and Chris can probably tell us the stories of overseeing regulatory approval for devices. But of course, as the ethicists, we are here to, like you said at the beginning, Andrew, it's the beginning of a conversation. As people are developing these devices, call us up. You'll probably end up talking to Andrew as you get advice on ethically planning and designing and then testing devices. So again, thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you all for being here. Our next Treats Talk, we'll be advertising that soon. That's in October. Our Professor Ott will be doing that. And we'll see you then. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again, Andrew.